Thank you very much for coming to this special conversation with Professor Grosjean. I'm very impressed already to see so many people come to this event interested in bilingualism, and it gives me great joy because, like you might have heard, here at the French Embassy, we believe in bilingual education, and we even launched our own bilingual revolution. And it's great to have experts like Professor Grosjean come and help us understand bilingualism a little better. This event tonight is sponsored by the Embassy of France, the cultural services of the French Embassy, and Albertine. I invite you to go next door and take a look at Albertine and perhaps buy Professor Grosjean's books. They're available. A special thanks to Bénédicte de Montlord, our cultural counselor, and Thomas Michelon, as well as our book libraire, our librarian, Francois Grosjean, for orchestrating this special evening. It's a busy week in New York. We have the Pope coming. I think you've heard about that. The Pope is coming in town, and a few heads of states, and even Beyoncé. And Francois Grosjean is in town. Yes. I'm tempted to call him the Pope of bilingualism, but maybe it's not the right way to say it. But I thought we could start with a few short questions about yourself so that people here in the room understand who you are and can situate you a little bit. So, first of all, François, or Professor, should I say? François is okay. Are you French? Are you English? Are you Swiss? Or even are you American, considering the number of books you've published in this country?
Okay, I'll try and make it short. Thank you, first of all, for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. By the way, if I keep looking towards this in that direction, it's because I've been listening to your question and then I sort of answer here. But I like you people just as much, okay? So it's just that I may not look at you quite as often. I was born in France. My father is French, and therefore at that time I got French nationality. But my mother's British. And then all kinds of things happened to me and my life, and I was educated for 10 years in English schools. So when I was 18, I was basically British. But then I came back to France to do my university studies, and then I came to the States for 12 years and enjoyed it a lot. When I left, in fact, they said, "You've made it here, you're a full professor, you've got an NSF grant, why are you going back to Europe?" And I say, look, if a Californian leaves Massachusetts to go back to California, why can't a Frenchman go back, or European go back to Europe? Anyway, and then we've been living in Switzerland for some 30 years. So culturally, I'd say I'm a member of 4 cultures. I'm a mosaic of cultures. I'm very pleased to be a mosaic of cultures. As for nationalities, I have 2 nationalities, French and Swiss.
Oh, very good. French and Swiss. But do you remember how you became bilingual, since you speak both languages, French and English, fluently and equally?
I remember it very well, because I'm not one of these infant bilinguals. Infant bilinguals, by the way, are very rare. They only represent between 15 and 20%. Most of the literature is on these wonderful little children. My grandson is an infant bilingual. But I was an adolescent bilingual, or older child bilingual. My mother, British, decided that I should learn English, and so she took me out of my primary school in France. Basically, she kidnapped me. It's a real story, in fact, she did. And put me into an English school in Switzerland. And over the next months, with the help of some of the kids who knew some French, and the teachers who knew some French, And my willingness to learn English, I became bilingual in this English boarding school in Switzerland.
And is your own family bilingual, I guess?
It is, but we started it in the wrong way. We came to America when our oldest son was almost 2 years, and we said, oh, we'll speak French at home, and he'll go to an English-speaking daycare, and everything will be fine. Of course, it didn't work. And at the time, I hadn't really given it much thought, but little Mark very quickly became an English-speaking monolingual. Then, thank God, a sabbatical came along, and we had a chance to go back to Europe, and so we chose a French-speaking country, Switzerland, and our children, both boys, 10 and 5, became bilingual, and now, in fact, one is quintilingual, 5, and the other one is trilingual. So, for parents who are despairing, don't despair. Think of us. We brought 2 monolingual children to Switzerland. On my blog in Psychology Today, I talk about these 2 kids who arrived in a small Swiss village, 2 Americans, and they became what they are now. So don't despair.
Very good. So everyone has a personal story with bilingualism, and I'm sure everyone in the room has a personal connection with languages and multilingualism as well. But would you say that your personal story with bilingualism helped you get into the research and write those books?
I think it did. I've sort of gone through all kinds of stages, starting off monolingual, becoming bilingual, changing dominance. 10 years of English education makes you basically English speaking, and then back to France, to the States, etc. So I know all about changing dominance. I know about becoming bilingual successively. I know about raising bilingual children, making mistakes, doing it right afterwards. And I'm witnessing my own little grandson being a simultaneous bilingual from birth. So I think all of that was great help. But then what's crucial, one has to have a personal experience, but one needs to also read up a lot. It's not because you are bi or multilingual that you know about bilingualism or multilingualism, okay? You really do need to read up on the subject, see what the research is done, and the mixture of the two, of personal experience and scholarship, I think helps one really get to the bottom of things.
Very good. So let's get into the serious stuff. Now, you've written many books over 30 years of academic work and research, and we have 2 of them, the most recent ones here. One in English, which is bilingual life and reality, the reality of a bilingual individual, and then your latest book in French, Parler plusieurs langues, le monde des bilingues. So, what were the reasons, that pushed you for writing these books?
I've done in fact, I did my master's thesis on bilingualism, so you can sort of deduce how many years I've been thinking about this. But when I was getting on in years, I told myself, we really need some books that are for the general public. A book that anybody can pick up and read and learn about bilingualism. So I went back to Harvard. My first book was Harvard University Press. And I said, would you be ready to help me write a general public book that answers simple questions like, who is bilingual? What is bilingualism? Is it okay not to know language fluently, both languages fluently? What's the difference between bilingualism and biculturalism? Do bilinguals have split personalities? The kinds of questions we've all asked ourselves. And they said, go ahead, do it. And so I did it. That's this first book here on the English book. By the way, the titles are not mine. For those who publish books, you know publishers impose titles. I wanted something much better, but anyway. And then I told myself, hey, you like challenges. What about writing a book in French? I taught in French for some 30 years, but writing a full book, I wasn't used to, okay? Because I do most of my writing in English. So the story there is incredible. French publishers are extremely closed. You know, you can't get access to the top ones. But anyway, I emailed this person, and she said, come and see me. So I went to see her. I brought some Swiss chocolates, and
he gave me some tonight as well, so thank you for that.
And she came down looking worried, you know, the way the French can look worried and busy, and can you remind me why you're here? And I said, well, it's to talk about a book on bilingualism. Well, come up to my office. So I went up to her office and I said, before we start, madame, I'd like to bring you some Swiss chocolate, okay? And just at that point, her mother, her very elderly mother, phoned, and she sort of broke the spell and had to speak to her elderly mother. And when she'd finished, I said, you know, I have a very old cousin, she's 92, and we started talking about that. So I think it's a question of senior citizens plus chocolate gave me the contract.
I should remember this from my own books. And what position do you defend in the recent books?
Well, just simple things that you know, everybody knows, because they all say, of course, it's self-evident. Bilingualism is widespread. Okay, half the world's population is bilingual. You can become bilingual at any point in your life, in early childhood, adolescence, adulthood. We're not born translators. I'm a terrible translator. Bilingualism and biculturalism are not the same thing, and they're not coextensive. You can be bilingual without being bicultural. Bilingualism doesn't create any delay in children. It doesn't have negative effects on language learning, on general learning. There are many approaches to leading to success with bilingualism. The kinds of things that need to be said, and you know, that very pointy research maybe sort of doesn't have time to say. Well, I tried to say it in these books.
But who is a bilingual? Can you tell us?
Honor to Americans, two North Americans, researchers back in a long time ago for some here, okay, in the 50s, 1950s, came up with a very reasonable definition of bilingualism, which I've adopted, which is simply the regular use of two or more languages. Their name are Ural Weinreich and William McKay. Very sensible definitions, because if you regular use means knowledge. Of course it means knowledge. You can't use a language if you don't know the language. So knowledge is there, but knowledge isn't the prime criterion for defining a bilingual. Now, in the layperson's viewpoint, it's speaking fluently both languages without an accent, having learned both languages as a child, etc., all kinds of factors. But I think simply the person who uses two or more languages in everyday life is a bilingual or tri- or quadrilingual person. I think it's a much more reasonable definition, and that's the one I've been adopted and that I've been using ever since.
Very good. And it's not, so many people have a monolingual view of bilingualism. And why do you think this is so pervasive, this view?
When I wrote my first book for Harvard back in 1982, it's in fact on that table over there. Thank you, Albertine. At the end of the book, I told myself, you haven't really said what you think about this question of what it means to be bilingual. You've done a lot of things in that book. Okay, do buy it, it's great. But there's something more. Maybe I needed to write the book to get to that extra point, which is basically the viewpoint that I developed 30 years ago, which is a holistic viewpoint of bilingualism, where the bilingual is a human communicator, a speaker-hearer in his or her own right, who manages life with two or more languages. And what I basically did in those papers in 1985, the bilingual is a specific hearer-speaker, and then a few years later, the bilingual is not two monolinguals in one person. So I developed the idea that as soon as you're bilingual, or tri, or quadri, or quinquelingual, you are a different communicator. You communicate just as well, but you just do it differently, okay? And to get away from this yardstick with the monolingual, And in fact, I've never understood, and that's why I did those papers, why the monolingual, apart from scientific understanding, why the monolingual was the yardstick. In fact, there are two yardsticks. You know, life is complex. There's the monolingual, and then there's this bilingual. And what's nice is that this holistic viewpoint of bilingualism has progressed, and many people here who work in the field of bilingualism have adopted it, and I'm thrilled. But basically, back then, the monolingual was the yardstick, and those who were considered bilingual were these, what I now call exceptional bilinguals, translators, interpreters, bilingual authors. I mean, I give them a lot of space in both my books, but they are exceptional bilinguals. And I'm interested in the run-of-the-mill bilingual, okay? And there's another approach to that run-of-the-mill bilingual, and that's what I wanted to do and explain in these books.
And you have proposed the complementary principle to characterize the bilingual, but could you tell us a little more about this idea?
Yeah. There are 2 or 3 basic characteristics or concepts that are crucial in understanding bilingualism. And I'm not going to sort of be over-scientific, but one of them is what I've now called the complementarity principle, which is basically, it's very simple, that we as bilinguals use our languages in different situations with different people in different contexts to do different things. Now, of course, sometimes the same domain is covered by both languages, okay? But there are other domains of life which are covered by just one language, okay? And in my various books, you'll see a grid where you have languages covering one domain, languages covering both, 2 domains, 3 domains, etc. But basically, we use our languages for different things, okay? And as soon as we understand that, we can understand things like fluency. If you're not fluent in both your languages to the same extent, it's probably because you don't need to be fluent in both your languages to the same extent. If you don't know how to translate from one language to another, it's probably because you're translating from a domain which is covered by one language, and you don't have the translation equivalence. The example I always give is when I was in the States, I used to teach statistics. In fact, I've written a book on statistics. It's one of my several books. And that was my English domain. I came to Europe, I came to Switzerland, was asked to teach a course, and I struggled for a year. I just did not know the vocabulary, and I would constantly ask people, I know the notions, I know the concepts, but I didn't know the words. And if one understands that principle, one can understand fluency, one can understand dominance, language dominance. Maybe you just use some of your languages in less domains, in less situations, then therefore you're dominant in the other language, translation, etc. It explains many different things. And it also explains why children do not develop to equal vocabularies in each language, okay? You just have to look at a bit of that geography of how the languages are spread across their lives, and you'll understand perfectly why one language is maybe not fully covered in the sense it doesn't have a full vocabulary, whereas the other does. Of course, if you add both 2 or the 3 or the 4 vocabularies, you get far beyond what a monolingual child has.
And you've developed the concept of language mode. Could you tell us what this is about and why is it important for understanding the bilingual?
Okay, so I've just given you one brick that's crucial. Okay, please walk away with the idea that with this idea of the complementary principle. And the second brick is language mode, and that's crucial too. Basically, as a bilingual, as a trilingual, we're constantly asking ourselves, without asking ourselves, what language should I be speaking now? Okay, currently it's English. And the second question we're asking ourselves is, do I bring in the other language or not? Okay, the first question is language choice, and it's a fascinating topic. I loved writing about language choice because it's hyper complex, but we do it so well. We just do it so well. We know that in this situation, with that person, for that context, etc., it's going to be that language. It really breaks down. It does sometimes, okay? And the other one is, do I bring in the other language? If I don't bring in the other language, I call that being in a monolingual mode. And all of us here go about our lives often being in a monolingual mode, okay? And if we don't have an accent in the language, if we're pretty fluent in the language, you know, we might surprise people. They say, oh, I didn't know you also spoke Russian or French or whatever, okay? At the other end of the continuum, we're with bilinguals who share our own languages, with whom we feel comfortable enough to use the 2 or 3 or 4 languages together in the form of code switching and borrowing, okay? But it's a continuum. And what we're doing is we're navigating constantly, okay, every minute of the day, as it were, along that continuum, changing base language, changing the main language we're speaking, and deciding whether we should bring in the other language or not. And so the language mode has really explained, has helped us understand many things, okay? Ophelia Garcia very kindly is here, and I'd like to say hello officially to her. And she's done a lot of work on the bilingual, what I would call the bilingual language mode, that is being in a situation where you can use the full extent of your languages to communicate, to do things, to interact, to write, to read, etc. Okay? I would call that being in a bilingual mode. Okay? But of course, children, adults also need to learn to be in a monolingual mode, because we do spend quite a bit of time speaking, writing, etc. monolingually. So I think the notion of language mode is another one of these really crucial notions when we understand, in trying to understand bilingualism.
Both of my daughters will go to a French dual language program, and I believe they are bilingual and bicultural. Should I be worried? Or could you tell us more about biculturalism?
Yeah. No, don't be worried. It's wonderful. Two things, maybe. The first is that bilingualism and biculturalism are not the same thing, okay? Especially in Europe, there are many people who are trilingual, but who are not bicultural or tricultural. Think of all those wonderful Dutch speakers who speak beautiful English. You go to Amsterdam and they speak English to you. They're not bicultural. I mean, they've learned the language, but they've never lived in the other culture. You know, it's not to bring them down, it's just that they haven't needed to be brought up in the other culture. So bilingualism and bicultural are not the same thing, okay? Of course, they can cohabit, and they do in many people. And what does it mean to be bicultural? It means to interact with 2 or more cultures. It means to be in contact, to interact, and also to merge certain aspects of the 2 cultures. And that's a very interesting thing in being bicultural. I don't know about you people who are bi or multicultural, but there are certain things that are sort of merged in one's behavior. And I sometimes have difficulties with those things. Space is one of them. When I come to America, I suddenly realize, hey, you're much too close to the person next to you, because I'm using my French space or Swiss space, okay? And I look at people looking at me saying, wow, so I back off, okay? Being in a cafe in France, my English side comes through, and I don't dare say, garçon, deux bières, s'il vous plaît, you know. I said, s'il vous plaît. Of course, he doesn't pay attention to me, you know. Pardon, you know. Being bicultural is very interesting. Many of us do it well, okay? We know how to behave as an American, more or less, in an American home, etc., French. But there are certain aspects which are blends, and that makes it fascinating. But I do want to say something about biculturalism, because it's something that we don't learn enough about. There are whole chapters here in these books on that, and that's the notion of identity. I don't know how many of you have been through the identity, I won't say crisis, but powerful, you know, moment where you ask yourself, am I American, am I French, am I American, am I Mexican, etc. And one's got to sort of work that out, okay? Work it out, basing ourselves on the perception of others, okay? Others won't sort of say, you French people, you know, and you say, but I'm also American, you know. Basing ourselves on their perception, on all kinds of things, on our needs, etc. And then deciding to, if possible, accept who you are, and that is a combination of several cultures. Too often, especially when you're an adolescent, you choose one or the other. You're forced into one or forced into the other. And you say, no, I'm not. I don't want to have to do anything with my Mexican roots. I'm American, etc. And that's too bad. And if there's one thing we can do as parents and educators and scientists, etc., is help our young people, in the sort of teens, to sort of understand, first of all, what it means to be bicultural, and secondly, to come to the point where they say, it's okay to be both. It's okay to be a member of three cultures. I can be dominant in one culture, dominant in the other. It's okay. I'm a bit this, a bit that. And that's why now I say, as I said at the beginning, I'm proud to say I'm a mosaic of several cultures. And that's my identity. Okay? I don't have to just choose one identity. I can choose several identities.
I'd like to do a quick survey in the room and see how many parents of bilingual children we have here tonight. Could you raise your hand if your children are bilingual? All the way to the back. And another question. How many teachers, bilingual ed teachers, do we have in the room? So let's talk a little more about the role of the family and the role of the school in the life of bilingual children. And what do you think should parents ask themselves when should they try to plan the bilingualism of their children?
Okay. If parents could, it would be wonderful. But at the same time, I know what it's like to be a parent and now a grandparent, and we're busy doing all kinds of other things, okay? But if one can work out a plan, at least at the beginning, and try and work it out, so that'd be very nice. I think there are a number of questions we should ask ourselves. First of all, when should the languages be acquired, okay? And that's not a difficult question. It doesn't have to be from birth, okay? I mean, I only learned English when I was 8. I got first prize in English literature in my school. I mean, it can be done at various points in life. When is the best time for the family to make sure that the child becomes bilingual and keep up his bilingualism? Because that's the problem. If you start too early, sometimes you don't have the resources to keep up the child's bilingualism. So one is, when should the languages be acquired? The second question is, what strategy will you use? Will you use a one person, one language strategy, which isn't the only one, okay? The one I prefer is one language in the home, one language outside the home. But there are various other strategies. Books are full of these approaches. The third question is, how can I make sure that the child will need both languages? The magical word, okay, well, it's a third now, complementarity principle, language word, need, okay? Children are wonderfully pragmatic beings, okay? If they feel they don't need a language, because Mama and Papa understand English perfectly well, okay? Why should I push and speak French, okay? So we have to create the need. And when we brought back our kids from Switzerland, for 3 years, we kept up their French by creating a need. You know what we did? First of all, we invited all their friends from Switzerland over to America for a month. They were thrilled, okay? Parents paid for the trip, okay? And then we had a monolingual kid in the house. Fantastic, our kid, there's need, okay? We'd go find newcomers, new French families, and say, see if the kids would play together, okay? And if they did, we had 2-3 months of French speaking before English came in, There are all kinds of ways of creating a need. If you do create a need, and not the need, speak French because I told you to speak French, that's not a need, okay? But a real communicative need, then I think you'll be doing well. Another question is, what other support can you count on? It can't just be one parent, okay? It's got to be, if possible, other people, other adults, other children, maybe the community, the schools, and that's why I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to tell Fabrice how wonderful I think his initiatives have been, because you're creating a need for French in this case in New York, of all places. Fantastic, okay? Find support in the community, in educators, etc. And if possible, think about all of that before you start on your road to bilingualism, and don't think if possible, but you all know this, that you know what the answers are, think about it, read up, and that's why I wrote these books, read about bilingualism, and try, if possible, to not make mistakes, because if you do, and you little by little you realize that your child doesn't want to speak to you in Hungarian or Russian or whatever, you'll feel terrible. You'll say, what have I done wrong? You'll be upset. And the child won't be upset and all that. There are nice, natural ways of doing it where everything can happen quite nicely, freely, serenely, and that's why one's got to think about this. By the way, we'll end with how can we read you more, and I really advise you, because it's simple, it's free, you don't have to buy a book. I have a blog on Psychology Today called Life as a Bilingual, and where I write short pieces, and there are many, many on bringing up children as bilinguals, okay? So just go on the blog and read up on that, on those. And one of the posts is basically the questions parents should ask themselves when raising bilingual children. And of course, there are many other books around.
So I've read many blogs and even many articles in the press recently, and I'm ready to believe that my children will be geniuses, because they're just bilingual. Therefore, there are so many advantages to being bilingual that they'll do very well in life. But I'm sure there are also a few disadvantages of being bilingual. Or maybe you could just help us go through both advantages and disadvantages.
There are many advantages. There are sometimes disadvantages. One's got to be realistic. Now, of course, you know that researchers have been looking at very cognitive type aspects, and I think it's a sort of young literature, let's say it this way, okay? I was going to say a messy literature, it's not that messy, but it's a young literature, okay? And there are counterexamples, so one's got to be careful. But it really does seem as if cognitively, on various aspects, bilingual children seem to do things more easily, okay? Just a number of these things. But when I was writing my books, I actually went to bilinguals to ask them what the advantages and the disadvantages were of being bilingual. And maybe it might interest you to know what your fellow bilinguals told you. Of course, the first one is you're able to communicate with different people. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. You have access to literature and movies and whatever in several languages. What it seemed, they told me, these were adults, that it helps you learn other languages, which is true, okay? It fosters, with biculturalism, of course, open-mindedness and different perspectives on life. What I love is when we can sit down and say, yeah, I understand why you're saying this, I understand where you're coming from, but of course I understand that this person is coming from another world and says this thing, etc. It gives us this perspective on differences, which is so crucial. And of course, it gives us many more job opportunities, or our children, our grandchildren, etc. Now, when I asked bilinguals what the disadvantages were, rest reassured, only a third mentioned any disadvantages. 2/3 said there weren't any, so that's good, okay? But when they did mention a few disadvantages, they said, well, communicating in your weaker language can be tiring, especially, they didn't mention the complementarity principle, but it was there, especially when it's in a domain or a situation where you're not used to using that language, right? They also mentioned the fact that sometimes it's difficult to translate. Same reason, complementarity principle. How many of us have been asked to help somebody translate a text, and we suffer like crazy because we just don't know the field, that's a particular area, we don't know the vocabulary, etc. So they've said that. They also say when they're tired or stressed or drunk or whatever, that they speak the wrong language, or they don't get their words out, or whatever. And of course, if you push them a bit, they'll say adjusting to cultures, because many, especially around here, bilinguals are also bicultural, and it's adjusting to the cultures and being accepted for who they are, okay? That is, members of 2 or more cultures, speaking 2 or more languages.
There are, in New York City, there are a number of dual language programs in schools of course, you have excellent private schools that offer a bilingual program, and now you find so many more public schools that are and that have offered for years actually the dual language education. It started with Spanish, obviously, then Mandarin, and in recent years French, and I heard last week Italian and Japanese were offered as well, and there's a German program in the works and a Polish program in the works, and I think it's wonderful that it becomes accessible, and I wonder if you could say a few words about how schools can help children become bilingual, be bilingual.
Yeah. In both books, I have a whole chapter on schools, and I have two parts in these chapters. One is schools that do not foster bilingualism, and schools that do, okay? And schools that do not foster bilingualism, but basically monolingual schools, that basically don't do much for second language learning, and, sorry to say it so bluntly, kill the second language that a child might have when he or she comes to the school, okay? And that's a shame. I think many years ago I wrote an op-ed for a Miami newspaper on the advantages of the national and natural resources that we have in these young children who have other languages. America does have foreign languages, but they're in a way in the wrong people. I'm sorry to say it this way, but because I don't believe it. But if only schools could help these young children maintain some of their languages. And of course, a very well-known linguist that many of you know who lived in New York, Joshua Fishman, did so much and said so much about language maintenance. So if only these monolingual schools could do something about language maintenance, that would be wonderful. But of course, the schools who help, bilingual children, improve bilingualism or give bilingualism to children, you know them well. I must admit my favorite approach, and I'm not saying this because Fabrice has invited me here, but I think it's a dual language approach. I think it's a wonderful approach where you have about half the kids of one language background, the other half of the other, and there's this mutual interplay between the two. Sometimes you as a student of the other language need help, and the other kid helps you with that language, and then you turn roles, you know, and you can help that other kid with something in your language. I think it's a wonderful approach, which, by the way, also exists in many other countries. And just down the road from where I live, in a small mountain town in Switzerland, there's on the side of a beautiful lake, Bienne is a bilingual city. There is one of these dual language programs at the level of high school, and it works beautifully, okay? And it really does foster bilingualism. So I'm a strong proponent of dual language programs. Regular immersion programs, I defend too. The only thing I say to whoever wants to listen to me is do something to make sure that these kids use the other language. Because if they just go back home and speak English all the time or whatever it is, they're not going to be using their other language learned in immersion schooling. So go on trips, bring in friends, whatever, you know, use Skype to try and develop the other language.
In recent years, or at least it's my opinion, I believe that bilingual education has resurfaced as a powerful method of instruction. And even people say that it can bridge the gap between rich and poor. I don't know if it's true, but I still feel there's a gap between those who see bilingual education as a way to teach English to immigrant children, and maybe it's the only way or the only use for bilingual education. Then you have the other groups that think that bilingual education should help people preserve their heritage, and then you have another group that says, well, bilingual education should be about teaching a foreign language to monolingual America, and what's your opinion on this definition issue?
You've maybe realized in the 45 minutes that I'm a very diplomatic type of person. In fact, my dream was to be a diplomat, but it never happened. I went off and wrote books on bilingualism. I think that it's a pity that we pit one approach against another. If we could have the child at the center, as it were, and think about his or her future, and we could agree that As President Obama said when he was running for president the first time around, every child in America should be bilingual. If you want to actually read the exact words, go to my blog, and it's one of the earlier posts where I've got a photo of President Obama who says every American kid should be bilingual. If we could agree that it's good to know 2 or more languages, and whatever the approach, let's go for it. Let's help these kids know those languages, use those languages. Then I think we wouldn't have these little fights, if you want. But of course, if the aim is for monolingualism, then there is much we can do. But if we can agree that it's a good thing to know and use several languages, then I think whatever the approach, whoever does it, let's go for it. Let's help one another, okay? But it does need some kind of, as it were, political issue. I'm going to tease you, Fabrice, because you represent the French government. When I was writing this little book here, I realized that, in fact, France isn't so hot on bilingualism. It is abroad. It is abroad. It's wonderful abroad. It's in fact, its policy
I'm hot about bilingualism.
It's wonderful abroad. It says, let's go for bilingualism, but I wish it would go for bilingualism in its own country, in France. And it's got a real hard problem because, of course, let me say it in French, on ne peut pas être français en étant bilingue, which is crazy. You can't be French without being bilingual. I'm French, I'm bilingual. And in fact, 20%. It's the same percentage, by the way, as in America. About 20% of the population uses 2 or more languages. Same percentage in France. So what you guys are doing here, as I told you before we started, if only you can import it back to France, I mean, why not? I mean, you know, why not? That'd be wonderful.
People are watching, and the live stream is on, so I'm sure we could wave to people in France. They're taking notes.
Good, good.
Before we take questions from the audience, let's end with a few more questions about yourself. And if people in the room or watching the live stream want to follow you and your work, what's the best way of doing that?
Okay, I really think the cheap, easy way is my blog, Life with 2 Languages. I mean, that's a simple way, okay? It's just type Life with 2 Languages or type François Grosjean and you'll come to my blog. And by the way, I'm very proud of writing that blog. I'm one of the very few Europeans who've been called upon by Psychology Today, I mean a reference, okay? We are 850 bloggers for Psychology Today. It goes all the way from, well, think of psychology, okay? And there are very few of us from Europe, and I'm happy to be one of them. There you got short tidbits, 800 to 1,000 words, tell you different things. Of course, there are the different books, but also on my own website, I have a few documents that you can go and download. And by the way, I shouldn't say this so loudly, but I'm a good emailer. When somebody writes to me, I answer, okay? So write to me, and I can answer your questions.
And what are your current projects? Can you tell us about it?
Yeah. I've just finished writing this last summer. Took me 2 months of heavy writing, the story of my parents. We don't have time, we should answer questions on bilingualism, but the story of my parents is incredible. I basically grew up without knowing my parents, okay? My father was a French fighter pilot during the war. He went to Great Britain. He was one of the happy few who fought with de Gaulle, and met my mother. They had the time to have 2 children, and then basically we were put in with nannies, foster homes, boarding schools, okay? And, well, that's the way it is. 50 years later, I said, maybe I should try and find out about who these people were, okay? And I went off on a quest to find out who they were. And my father, whose name is Professor Grosjean, you can look him up on Wikipedia, was a fighter pilot, but he was also a double agent for MI5. So if you like James Bond, my father was one of those people. And for a very short time. And he did something very special. He was one of the few who was sending wrong information to the Germans on where the Normandy landings would be, okay? basically the wrong information was they would be near Calais and Dunkirk and not in Normandy. So he was playing a crucial role, although it wasn't the one that he wanted. He wanted to be a fighter pilot, and there he was writing secret letters to German contacts in Barcelona, giving them this kind of wrong information. He met my mother, and this is, hold on tight, okay? It blew my mind. There's every evidence now that my mother was in fact put there to keep an eye on my father, okay? But James Bond girls don't become pregnant, my mother did, okay? So the two of us were born, and there's a lot of evidence. And so when I went to Agbin Michel after this book, and I said, I've got a very different book, this is the book, they said, we want your book. They gave me a contract.
I had a final question about, have you ever regretted being bilingual?
It's an easy question in a sense because you don't regret who you are. Maybe when you're young, when you're 16, 17, you may regret, but when you reach my age, you don't regret. It's basically we are who we are, right? So for those of us who live with languages, we are who we are. And if we can come to a point in our lives where we say, this is the way it is, I am who I am, then that's the best way to deal with it. But I would say the one thing, that the transition periods, you know, when I went back from leaving my English school at 18 and coming back to France, that was very, very difficult, okay? Because nobody was there helping me, accompanying me, listening to me, okay, saying, why is it so different? You know, who is Léon Citron? What is, you know, I mean, all kinds of little things, you know. And so the transition periods can be difficult when you change situations, change countries, start up a new language, stop a language. And that's where we as parents, as educators, as teachers, need to be close to these kids going through these transition periods. Let's do our best to help them understand what's going on. And it's easy for them to understand if we explain it in simple terms, and we can. So all I'm saying is, let's help these children, these adolescents, be happy and proud to be bilingual.
Professor Grosjean, thank you very much. We'll take a few questions. We have a few mics running. I'm going to ask some help from my friends at the back. Raise your hand if you have a question. Make it a short question, please. No long comments. So I see a few hands, and in the front as well. So we've got this gentleman. Yep.
Recently, within the last year or so, on National Public Radio, there was a woman researcher who spoke about bilingualism, mentioning that in her research there was a greater capacity for bilingual people to multitask. And more significantly in terms of this question, although I would ask you whether you agree with that, her point of view from a strategic implementation by parents was to have one caregiver, presumably one parent, speak only one language to the child, and the second parent or caregiver speak only the second language. And at least as I understood it, she was saying that without that strategy, the benefits were significantly less, if existing at all.
Okay, it's a shame. The first point she made was correct. Because bilingual children, adults, need to switch from one language to the other, bring in the bilingual mode, go to the monolingual mode, they can blank out, as it were, control other tasks, okay? So basically they can multitask, they can sort of separate out different things, okay? And so the multitasking is not wrong. Where I think it is wrong, unfortunately, is that the best strategy is the one parent, one language approach, OPAL it's called. In fact, good research by a Dutch linguist, De Hoover, Belgian linguist, excuse me, Annick de Hoover, shows that only 3/4 of children actually become bilingual. You lose a quarter, okay? Whereas if you use the one language in the home, one language outside the home, you get about 95% success. So I'm not saying you shouldn't use it, but the one parent, one language approach has this difficulty that the minority language is only defended usually by one parent, okay? The outside community doesn't defend Chinese, you don't find Chinese-speaking children in the street, etc. So it's extra work for the minority language in the one parent, one language approach. So be careful, read up. I mean, that's what I say to everybody. Read up on the various strategies, see the fors and against, and then choose the one that fits you, okay? It could be that the one parent, one language strategy works well, and that's fine. What really counts in the end is that you do have a happy bilingual environment in your family or in your child, and there isn't this kind of rejection of the other language, I won't speak to you kind of approach, you know, that some children do, because it's difficult for the parents, and it's sometimes difficult for the children too.
So we had enough. Go ahead, and then we'll move to the front.
Good evening. You mentioned that your dominant language switches, or has switched in the past. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, you mentioned your dominant language has switched a couple times. And you also kind of made an example of a question that your first book addressed was, do bilinguals have split personalities, which everyone kind of laughed at. But I am curious, do you notice any aspect of your personality changing when you take up another dominant language?
I have two posts on split personality or double personality aspect on my blog. Do look at them for those interested. First of all, what do bilinguals say? They say very often, I feel different when I speak English than when I speak Spanish or Ukrainian or whatever, okay? And that's for sure. I mean, that's fine. Yeah, but does that mean that they have a double personality? Basically, the argument that I put forward and that others have put forward in the last 30 years, but people don't want to listen to them, unfortunately, it deals with the complementarity principle. Languages are used in different situations with different people in different contexts, okay? So if you use one language with the president of your university, it's going to be a very formal type language, and you're going to feel different speaking English to that person than speaking, let's say, French to your wife, okay? And then you'll say, oh, but I was a different person when I spoke to the president of the university and when I was speaking to my wife. No, you just change situations. Another way of saying that is monolinguals also have to change their styles, their level of language when going from one situation to another. And what really convinced me is when a trilingual person wrote to me and said, I sometimes speak French to my sister, I sometimes speak English to my sister, I sometimes speak German to my sister. I'm the same person, okay? We are one person. It's just that sometimes for cultural reasons, for situational reasons, for context reasons, we have to adapt to those situations. And we do so, but we do so when we're monolingual too. So I'd be very, very wary of that. I'm not saying that bilinguals can't have split personalities, but then monolinguals also can have split personalities. But I wouldn't say that all bilinguals have a split personality.
Okay.
Could you speak about the ideal age by which or at which to learn a language? There's been research I've learned about stating that if a child learns a language other than his or her own by the age of 5, then that child will always be able to learn other languages throughout their life. And then there seems to be another demarcation right before adolescence. A friend of mine who teaches German to 7th graders says that she can tell the difference between the kids who have hit puberty. They have a much less facile time of picking up the German than the other children. For myself, I was exposed to French and Italian before puberty, and I find it easier to learn the Romance languages. I find it much difficult to try to pick up languages outside that Romance, the Latin-based languages.
That's another really hot topic in research currently, okay? Because you have the majority of people who think about these questions, and especially lay people, who say, start the earlier you can, okay? And in fact, I looked at that in my blog, when you start a language with a child, and there's evidence now that you can start really at any age, okay? And there are cases of adults becoming fantastic bilinguals. Two examples. Joseph Conrad, one of the main writers of English literature, you know, he wasn't English speaking. He learned English when he was 18, okay? And others, there are many others. So I think one's got to be very, very careful, and one's got to take into account the other factors I mentioned, apart from when, okay, all those other factors to make sure that it's going to be a successful bilingualism. So I wouldn't bet on any age. I've known people who started English at 15 who speak without an accent, because that's the one thing that we all agree on. The later you wait, the more it's going to be difficult to get rid of the foreign accent, so-called foreign accent, okay? But I've known people at 15 still managing to speak perfect American with an American accent. So one's got to be very careful. But it's a hot topic, and I don't think we really have the answer yet.
I see two hands here, if you don't mind circulating that microphone.
I have a friend whose daughter was trained as a pediatrician, and she told me that when they trained her daughter, they taught her to give a language test to kids that she would see in her office, and it basically consisted of trying to elicit words from the child. And her daughter, as a pediatrician, said that kids who were bilingual had a smaller vocabulary in English, of course, right? Then I had another situation where I was actually teaching foundations of bilingual education, and a student in my class raises his hand and says, well, my mother's a speech therapist, and here in the American Association of Speech Therapy website, it says that if you're bilingual, you're going to have it's more likely that you're going to have a speech impairment. And so speech therapists are apparently being trained to tell people not to raise their children bilingual. So it seems like there's conflicting research out there from different disciplines. So how do we as parents deal with that?
Be brave. No. On the first question, we covered it a bit. Children, because they will use their languages in different situations, different domains, different contexts, may well have small vocabularies when you look at the languages independently. I mean, if all the family language, if all the home language, the playing language is in language B, all the school language is in language A, of course you're going to have a small vocabulary overall in each of those languages. Putting all those vocabularies together, you're going to have a higher vocabulary, okay? So I think we should just put that aside, because it's basically, and research has looked at that, and when they control for these things, they show that bilingual kids are doing just as well as monolingual kids, and I do cover that in my blog. The other one is what to do with professionals who are not directly in contact, as it were, daily, as many of you are as parents and educators with bilingual children, and getting rid of that monolingual bias, okay? It's all part of that monolingual bias, that being bilingual is going to have, create delays. There's more and more and more research that says that is wrong, okay? There are just as many kids, thank God, thankfully not that many, just as many kids with language problems if monolingual or if bilingual, okay? Bilingualism does not create a language delay or a language challenge, as one would say now, okay? That is wrong. But getting that message to pediatricians, to speech therapists, is taking a lot of time. And what we need to do is just go out there with good data, with hopefully good books, make sure they read them, make sure we talk about them, and little by little get over that hurdle. You don't undo a monolingual bias in 10, 15, 20 years. It takes a long time. But thank God, there are more and more speech therapists who themselves are originally bilingual and who think differently because they've accepted their bilingualism. But you know, one difficult hurdle is for bilinguals to assume, to accept their own bilingualism. I found bilinguals, many bilinguals who are purists, okay? So you need to get them to understand who they are first, and then to bring that into their work, and little by little, the true picture will come out. But it's going to take some time, and all of us are here to help these people discover what bilingualism really is.
So if you could bring this young lady here has been waiting. I have one in it. I see more hands in the back, and then we go to the back.
Yeah, I have a question. Currently, one of the major issues of bilingual schooling is testing. The one that springs to mind is the National Standardized Test for public schools, but I can also think of the pressures of the French baccalaureate in private schools. So my question is, how can we, either teachers or school staff, how can we help children and possibly parents relieve the pressure, but also understand that English is important, le baccalauréat français is very important, but other languages are as well, especially those that are not necessarily tested?
I think it's a crucial question, and it's a difficult question, okay? Because at the same time, we'd like the kids to be happy using their various languages, but at some point in their life, they will have to be in a monolingual mode, okay? And behave more or less, okay, as monolinguals. So I would see this in a sort of two-prong approach. One side is to tell these various exam boards and testing boards, look, you're dealing with a bilingual kid, understand what bilingualism is, understand the complementarity principle, give some leeway, okay, because these kids are living their lives with two or more languages. So let's reduce this a bit. That's the strength of how strong the monolingual aspect is. And on the other side is tell kids, little by little, through example and exercises, look, sometimes you'll have to do everything in English, okay? So let's improve. And we, as parents, we spent hours and hours working on our kids' French and reading and writing and essays and whatever, because they needed that knowledge. They needed to be able to write good French, etc., to get their exams. So I think it's using both sides. And hopefully one day we'll get to, to a happy situation. But it's true, and we should not forget this, that some of our kids, and all of us, have from time to time to be in a monolingual mode, and we have to behave, as it were, and do well in a monolingual mode. But that doesn't mean that we should become two monolinguals, okay? So there's some movement to have on that front, I think.
Yeah, I have a question about written language, not only speaking, but learning how to read. So my question is, what do you think, or which kind of advice should be given to parents or educators about which kind of language you start with? If the child is bilingual by going to school and learning language at school, but having a maternal tongue that is in another language. Because I think it's very different to speak a language and to have access to the written language. For us here, it's obvious, but for a lot of immigrants, it's not the case. And when the alphabet is not the same, also, it's another trick that I think it's an important question. I just want to comment on something else. I am a child psychotherapist, and I work with very young children. And my experience is that it's very different. Of course, it's obvious, but it's very different to be bilingual because it's a need, and it's part of the dynamic of the family or of the immigration. than to have parents who are very sophisticated, like we are in New York. But you want your child to be able to learn Chinese before the age of 4, having a Spanish babysitter and 2 parents who speak I don't know what at home. Okay, so this is another story, because then the need is very different. And what I observe, and there are beautiful books in psychoanalysis about Babel Tower, La Tour de Babel, about the fact that you express some feelings in one language and then you dream in another language, and sometimes, yes, it's well integrated, but sometimes it's not. It's not a splitted personality, but it's just a fake part of yourself that has not integrated fully a foreign language. So it's tricky, but I remember Federer, the tennis player, saying that, you know...
I'm also Swiss.
Yes, saying that when he had aggressive impulses, he was speaking in French, but when he was very polite, he was in English. Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't dare counter a psychotherapist, but maybe Federer learned how to swear in French. But anyway, on the literacy aspect, I think what we need to do as parents, educators, is help our children enjoy deciphering the written word, however it's written, okay, Roman alphabet, other types of scripts, etc., curiosity in deciphering the word in reading, basically, okay? And so, of course, if the alphabets are the same, then there'll be what's called transfer, okay? The child will realize that if you read a particular sentence, that reading, the operation of reading works the same in the other language if the alphabet's the same, okay? If it's not, then the child, will transfer the idea that for one language it's left to right, the other it's the other way, etc. So most of the educators who work on biliteracy use this notion of transfer. Whichever language you start in, you work on the other more or less at the same time or just after, so that in the end the child is aware that languages are different, have different scripts, but lead to the same thing, which is basically going from a visual signal into concepts, okay? Now, for the other question, it's much too difficult, and it's, you know, parents who, and this, by the way, happens in France, but in other countries, where parents say, oh, I don't want my kid to learn Latin and Greek anymore. Why don't we give him some Breton for 2 years, okay? They don't speak Breton. And so they send their kids to a Breton bilingual program, and it's as a sort of cognitive exercise. All I can say is maybe these parents, we could try and educate them just a bit more, but it's very difficult to do on what bilingualism is, and not to let these kids stranded high and dry with their languages, but without any sort of help and need, etc. Hence my 5 questions to parents when you're making your child bilingual. Are you thinking about need? Are you thinking about support? Are you thinking about when? Are you thinking about these kinds of things? Okay, those crucial questions. But you know, parents are who they are, and we're all parents, and I mean, they don't have time to think about these things. So I think the kind of situation that you've talked about will continue having. Also, this notion that, oh yeah, let's get a Spanish-speaking nanny for 3 years. It'll do him some good, you know. So for 3 years, the kid will speak to his nanny or her nanny in Spanish, and then what? You know, it's and then parents are disappointed that Spanish disappears in 6 months, and they say, but we spent all this money and time and energy getting him to speak or her to speak Spanish. Again, I think it's a question of educating parents, but that's a really touchy subject. How do you educate parents on bilingualism and biculturalism? You know, it's it's a whole other evening together on that.
So we have time for a few more questions. I see hands in the back. Could we have another mic running in the back? And then we can take this question first, and then we'll stay with people.
Thank you very much. I love your story because when I was 25, I worked with Jean Petit, psycholinguist. So my dream was to become a psycholinguist, and I totally messed up. I became a diplomat. That being said, I'm requesting some advice, sharing an experience. Our little daughter is 2.5. It's amazing at 2.5 how she split the linguistic identity of the family. When she was 2 years and a half, she said, Papa says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Mama says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. English is forbidden at home. We don't do on a TV because we don't want English to enter the home. But she has, I mean, it's okay. She has 9-hour English in the daycare, but it's a daily struggle. I mean, it's okay. The problem is all of us, we cannot move to Switzerland. So do you have any advice of what kind of society, but because beyond the struggle of parents, any advice in your book, for example, I don't know, of how we could change society to make it easier for parents and children to become bilingual without having money, you know what I mean?
That's a really tough question. I'm just a citizen. What I often say in my writings is that most Western countries, but most countries of the world, have a fantastic asset, which is their languages. And if only those countries officially, first of all, could accept those languages and accept that people become bi or tri or quadrilingual, okay? But as you know, because of the history of nations and the sort of state, one language, one culture, one country, most countries have not developed the idea that it's okay to be American and bi or tri or quadrilingual, that it's okay to be French, okay? This little book I sent to the Prime Minister of France. And one day, with a nice little word, because this guy is quadrilingual, okay? I mean, Catalan, Spanish, French, English, and very nicely, he didn't have time to answer, but his chef de cabinet wrote to me saying, the Premier Ministre thanks you very much. He liked your book a lot, and he feels that bilingualism should be fostered and helped, and you know. And so I framed the letter because I told myself, hey, this is the beginning. This is the beginning of getting countries that are known as monolingual, okay, to change their approach. When Obama said every American child should be bilingual, that was so important. And I think everything that you guys are doing, everything that you're doing, we just got to keep at it, okay? And keep pushing that being bilingual doesn't mean that you're un-American. You know, feeling that you have in you a mosaic of cultures, American and French, doesn't mean that you're non-French, etc. That it's a different question, okay? That you can be the sum of various cultures, of various languages, and still be a good citizen, because that's the big scare, isn't it? And we've got to be careful with that. So I think we've just got to keep going, and maybe one day most children in most of these countries will grow up with several languages. We should also take an example on many African countries where it's totally normal to speak 3 or 4 different languages. Totally normal. In fact, so normal that you have to go to the neighboring village to find your spouse, and of course it's going to be in another language. Okay, so we've got to learn from those countries too.
I have 2 questions. My theoretical question is whether you could speak to any of your work or work with which you're familiar that considers the neuroscientific underpinnings of some of the principles you mentioned in complementarity, mode, and such. My second question is a more practical one. I currently work as a resident neurosurgeon at a nearby hospital, so unfortunately I rarely see my 2 small children at home, and also unfortunately I'm the French-speaking parent in our 1 language per parent model. So my 6-year-old daughter is essentially bilingual. My 3-year-old son, however, understands me now in French and absolutely will produce no French. And I wonder if you have any recommendations about how I can bring him up to speed.
You heard me speak, and I won't add to it. But just one thing, siblings are known to be even less ready to play a game, as it were, with their parents. And so with an elder sister with whom maybe he speaks English, with a dad he doesn't see that much, with not much French coming into the house, etc. I think you've explained it very well. And so think about how to create a need for French in your child. As for the neurological aspects, it's I think we talked about a bilingual revolution. There's a neurolinguistic revolution going on currently, and that's why I don't write too much about it, because it's still very new. A few years ago, 10, 15 years ago, without imaging techniques, one would sort of talk about the left hemisphere being for the second language and the right hemisphere and whatever, okay? Whereas now, with these sophisticated techniques, a whole new science is being developed, and some headway is being made, but there's nothing really, there's no great story coming out. I do try and uncover it. On my blog, you'll see a section called Bilingual Brain and Mind, and I interview a neurolinguist. I talk about some of the research, so you can read up on that. But it's still a very new science, because the technology has developed to make it an interesting science. If one can solve all these issues that brain imaging comes along with, which you know much better than I do, threshold, what counts, what doesn't count, what area is being activated, what isn't being activated. It's a tough field, and I think we need to wait just a bit before a good story comes out.
Very good. We have one last question at the back, and then we continue this conversation over a glass of wine. This is a French way.
French wine.
House.
French wine.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you for that. Is it possible to quantify the amount or rate or frequency in early childhood that you need for the kind of foundation that'll allow you later on to make a decision about whether you want to pursue a language or not? My situation is that my wife and I speak between us 4 languages. Our son is 2.5 years old, and he's exposed to all those languages every day, but in severely varying degrees, and I'm very concerned that he not lose one of the languages, which happens to be my first language, and Attaché, the one to which he's least exposed of the 4.
Family plan. Maybe one day I'll babysit for you, and you take your wife out to dinner and say, honey, or whatever, we need to talk about what languages we want to bring into the family, what not, because with 4 languages it might be just a bit difficult. But it's true that you do need to ask yourselves these questions. How can we foster each of those languages? And by the way, I've talked about bi, but in fact I often said bi or multi, because I've known families with 3 languages. I mean, it's no big deal, okay? But they sort of make sure that the situations are different, that there are times in the week, times in the day, where each language gets the kind of fostering that it needs, you see? And that's what you really need to work out. Based on the questions I raised, how much input, when, what situation, what's going to be our strategy, what support do we get from outside, who's the available grandparent. Grandparents are fantastic. I'm a grandparent. They bring in a language for half a day, a whole day, you know, and for free. You just need to feed them, you know. So I mean, it really is a question of language planning in the kind of family that you've described.
Thank you very much, Professor Grosjean. So this conversation will be available in a few hours on livestream.com/French Embassy, so you can watch it again. You can send a link to your speech therapists and other people who need help. Yeah, you can find out about the professor on his blog. Please, Professor, tell us more again.
If you just do www.François Grosjean in one word, no cedilla on the C, okay, Francois Grosjean. .ch, but if you just type my name, you'll see it. Just by typing my name, you'll see François Grosjean. Yeah.
And then, if you want to know more about the bilingual revolution, there's another website, the French Embassy's website, FrenchCulture.org. But there's one more thing that you need to know. There's soon going to be a big bilingual education fair on October 3rd at Hunter College. It is organized by FrenchMorning.com, hundreds of schools and exhibitors. So look at bilingualfair.org. You'll find brochures outside as well. Let's have a glass of wine. Let's continue this conversation. Thank you very much.
I mean, you did